still in a critical condition in a London hospital after emergency brain surgery following a world title bout last night. Watson collapsed after being knocked down in the final round of his super middleweight fight against Chris Eubank. Eubank was also taken to hospital after winning the fight. He was released from there a short time ago.
The moment it became clear this latest boxing defeat may have cost Michael Watson more than just a world title. The 26-year-old middleweight collapsed within seconds of being beaten by Chris Eubank, and after treatment at ringside was rushed from the fight stadium to the nearby North Middlesex Hospital for tests. Surgeons there, concerned by Watson's condition, transferred him immediately to St Bartholomew's for emergency brain surgery. All night, friends and relatives waited at the hospital for news of the boxer, until 6 hours after being admitted, the bad news came. Watson is very seriously ill.
Essentially, Michael has suffered a severe injury and has undergone some emergency surgical treatment for that to the head and is at the moment on the intensive care unit. He's obviously in quite a critical state, though at the moment is stable. We will continue to give him all the treatment we can, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to make some good progress. But I can make no real definitive statements about his prognosis or likely outcome at the moment.
The ultimate, of course, is that he won't recover at all. That's very unlikely. What he may be left with is a certain amount of damage to the brain and therefore a certain amount of paralysis on the opposite side of the body. Again, that's not very common, but it can occur. He will certainly have damaged a certain number of his brain cells, but hopefully he'll make a recovery and, to all intents and purposes, be able to carry on a perfectly normal life. What he won't be able to do again, as far as I'm concerned, is go back in the ring.
Boxing experts have always rated Michael Watson as one of the brightest middleweights in Britain. But unlike his counterparts, Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn, he's never made a fortune from boxing. Now it seems his chance to put that right may be gone forever. Gary Cottrell, Sky News.
This is the Sky World News Hour. I'm Chris Mann.
And I'm Stephanie Callister. Good evening. Also in this programme, we're joined by a doctor who wants boxing banned. And we hear firsthand of the horror of war in Yugoslavia from an eyewitness who has just returned.
But first, the boxing super middleweight contender Michael Watson is still fighting for his life tonight. This evening he underwent a second emergency brain operation. He collapsed after his world title fight against Chris Eubank last night. As a result of the injury, British boxing is bracing itself for another attack by the anti-boxing lobby.
It's the second neurosurgical operation that Michael Watson has undergone, an indication of the seriousness of his injuries.
Michael suffered a severe head injury resulting in the formation of a blood clot on the surface of his brain. During the early hours of the morning, he underwent an emergency craniotomy for the removal of this clot. His condition remained stable for 12 hours. He then deteriorated and is at present undergoing further surgery to his injured brain. He will then return to the intensive care ward on a life support machine.
The 26-year-old boxing professional was carried out of the ring. His super middleweight title fight stopped in the 12th round. His opponent, Chris Eubanks, also spent the night in hospital and then had this to say about the fight.
I've never ever been into the ring with someone with that type of power and relentless fighting attitude and willpower.
This was Michael Watson in training earlier this month, the protective headgear absorbing the punches. It's worn by all amateur boxers for training and for some matches, but it's not compulsory for professional fights. It's now being said things might have been different if Michael Watson had worn a headguard. The latest boxing incident comes after the Boxing Board of Control's decision to allow Frank Bruno to continue his professional boxing career. Bruno resumes fighting after a long debate and evidence from eye specialists on surgery he needed to repair retina trouble. He said of Watson today, no nicer or braver man ever climbed into the boxing ring. But are boxing injuries an acceptable part of the sport? There's always been political pressure to bring in a ban after serious injuries, but now it's growing in strength.
Last night's contest raises a very substantial number of questions about whether or not boxing is something that can be tolerated in a civilized society in the 1990s. Not only is Mike Watson fighting for his life in intensive care, and everyone must be hoping and praying that he survives, but we've also got the fact that the Victor, his opponent, the man who won the contest, had to be admitted to hospital suffering from exhaustion.
If you banned it, you drive it underground, there'd be no medical care. They'd go at each other hammer and tongs until they dropped, and that would be even worse. So there is no way you can legislate to stop this happening.
Sports Minister Robert Atkins is now being asked to mount a major inquiry into professional and amateur boxing. He says he didn't see the match and is expecting a full report from his officials. However, the minister wouldn't be drawn on the question. Are boxing's days as a sport now numbered? Christine Chapman, Sky News.
Thank you. Boxing's rich and famous gather at a plush London hotel to honour Henry Cooper and Muhammad Ali. But as the diners arrived, all thoughts were for Michael Watson, fighting for life in a hospital intensive care unit. Muhammad Ali didn't turn up. He was supposed to launch his autobiography, but went to Abu Dhabi instead. So it was left to Henry Cooper to defend boxing's reputation.
But if you ban it, you'll only drive it underground. And what's the good of driving it underground? Then you'll have worse things going on, because if you look at this unlicensed boxing that goes on now, they're all old fighters. They're all fighters that the Border Control has said, right, you're too old, you've got to quit. They all go into this unlicensed boxing. They're not medically examined. And it's not boxing, it's fighting. Literally, I mean, they hit each other when they're on the floor, they kick each other on the floor, and you don't want that in boxing. You might as well have it out in the open, where it can be controlled, where people are being medically examined regularly, and that's it.
Henry Cooper has heard many calls for boxing to be banned, but with MPs now calling for new legislation, it seems likely at the very least the government will launch an inquiry into the sport. Kieran Devaney, Sky News.
Welcome back. It's 1 o'clock. We've been on the air since 12:30, and we begin now with a summary of the main news so far. Doctors say the boxer Michael Watson has rallied somewhat after suffering a severe head injury during Saturday's World Super Middleweight title fight against Chris Eubank. Watson is still on a life support system in the intensive care unit at London's St Bartholomew's Hospital. The Sports Minister Robert Atkins has just said that Michael Watson's case is a tragic one, and he has asked for a full account of what happened. Controversy over boxing after the critical injury to Michael Watson. It's again provoked calls for the introduction of greater safety measures. Some critics want the sport to be banned altogether. Joining us from our Edinburgh studio is Mingus Campbell, the Liberal Democrat spokesman on sport, who wants greater safeguards. And with us here in the studio is Graham Houston, editor of Boxing Monthly, who says the sport would not be the same without the risk element. Mingus Campbell in Edinburgh first. Can things stay as they are?
I don't think so. I think the contest on Saturday night has thrown the whole future of boxing, both professional and amateur in this country, into very sharp focus. When you have a contest which results in Mike Watson fighting for his life, and I think everyone will be encouraged by what we just heard on your news roundup, and also when the winner of that contest has to go to hospital himself for treatment for exhaustion, I think that raises some very substantial questions in people's minds as to whether or not boxing is something which we ought to have in a civilized country in the last part of the 20th century, and if we do have it, whether the protection which ought to be available is sufficiently adequate to deal with the undoubted risks which exist.
All right, Graham Houston, is it right that a sport can produce results like we've seen?
It's a dilemma for people involved in boxing. Boxing has an inherent risk factor. It's got an essential rawness, and I think to take away that takes away the sport of boxing as such. So I think the British Boxing Board of Control stressed they are very strong on safety measures. They're going to try and increase safety measures, but to take away the essential rawness, you do destroy the sport as it stands. So I don't think it would work to make it, hate to say it, but to make it too safe.
But what do you say to people who say it is unique in that it is the only sport where the aim is to damage your opponent's brain by knocking them out?
Well, first of all, a boxer doesn't go into the ring with the idea of damaging an opponent's brain. The idea is to get the fight over with as quickly as possible by incapacitating the opponent. He doesn't go in thinking, I want to damage his brain. He wants to get the opponent out of the ring, get him defeated. Then he breathes a sigh of relief. It's over. He's expressed himself.
He has to hit
finished.
his head to do that, doesn't he?
He doesn't have to hit his head, yes. Absolutely.
Mingus Campbell, is it not a fair
That's the point that
fact?
I have most difficulty with. I mean, I've been to boxing matches and I've enjoyed them, both professional and amateur. So I don't come to this with preordained prejudice, determined to see the sport banned. But I do feel very great concern. I think a large number of members of the public will feel great concern about a sport which, as you just pointed out, has as its principal objective either the knocking out of the opponent or at least the beating of him into such a state of submission that he's unable to proceed. I think that's what raises questions in people's minds.
But Mr. Campbell, no fighter gets into the ring under duress. All fighters know what is involved. This is not the first time something like this has happened.
You're absolutely right. And I do not want to stand in the way of people like Barry McGuigan or Jim Watt from Scotland, who made substantial careers and substantial earnings from fighting, and who were national heroes as a result. But I do think we have to protect young men from their own enthusiasm. And I hope that the kind of inquiry which I've just written to Robert Atkins today, requesting him to set up, would deal not only with the principle, but also with the practicalities. For example, you win the Olympic gold medal as an amateur on 3 3-minute rounds. To win the world championship as a professional, you've got to fight 4 times that. Now, is that right? Is a 3-minute round the proper way? Should we have shorter rounds, greater intervals, fewer rounds? We've just come down, I think, fairly recently from 15 to 12. That's something I applaud. I think these are all matters which ought to be examined very critically, because after all of the fights that ever took place are not worth the death of any one man.
All right, Graham Houston, what about shorter rounds, for instance?
Well, as my friend the panellist said, the rounds in world title fights were reduced from 15 to 12 rounds when a fighter from South Korea died in the 14th round of a very hard fight in Las Vegas. But deaths have occurred in 3-round amateur fights. I think shortening rounds isn't really the answer, because fatalities can occur, unfortunately.
What about, for instance, head protectors?
Well, head guards are worn in the amateurs, but amateur boxers have died wearing head protection. There's also a school of thought that says, with head guards, that boxers are inclined to take more punches. They feel, with a head guard, they feel safer or more secure, so they don't pay as much attention to the art of slipping and blocking.
Mingus Campbell, Graham Houston made the point earlier on that it is a raw sport. It is one of the most basic instincts, simply to fight each other. You don't need a Formula One racing car. You don't need expensive equipment. If you try to make it safer, you're simply going to drive it underground, aren't you?
Well, I don't believe that you will destroy the element of skill. I mean, I remember when I was a very young schoolboy, my hero was Dick McTaggart, who 1956 in Melbourne won the gold medal for Scotland or for Great Britain, and he won the trophy for being the most stylish boxer in the contest. I think the element of style and skill is still able to be preserved, but I think you're right to point up the dangers of this being driven underground. There is already an existing subculture of unlicensed boxing, not illegal in the strict sense, but illegal because it's not under the control of the British board. And I would be very, very reluctant to see that happen or to be increased or encouraged as a result of any action which might be taken.
All right, let's end by turning it on its head, as it were, looking at it from the other way. The spectators, they literally bay for blood. Is that a good thing, Graham Houston?
I don't think they literally bay for blood. There is an element that wants to see blood and action and knockouts, but I think most boxing fans still want to see a good fight where the fighters are evenly matched, and no one wants to see a fighter hurt in the ring. That's the last thing anybody wants to see.
But Mingus Campbell, the hype that precedes a fight, the shouting that goes on.
I've been talking to a number of sports correspondents who were present at the fight on Saturday night, and without exception, they have expressed very considerable distaste and even anxiety about the kind of scenes which took place after the fight. And a lot of people relate that to the pre-publicity, the hyping up, as you describe it. I think that's an area where the British board has got to act to prevent people conducting themselves in such a way that when the fight actually takes place, the natural element of partisanship becomes or is demonstrated in the sort of distasteful scenes which we saw at the end of the contest on Saturday.
Gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Mingus Campbell in Edinburgh, Graham Houston in London. Thank you both very much indeed.
The surgeon in charge of his treatment said tonight he could recover fully or not at all.